my premature delivery. Um, I'm really very excited to be here, very pleased to be involved in this series. Dimpna Callahan tells me this is a great series of things and that everybody should be in them. What I thought I would do is give a presentation which really falls into two parts. One of them about aspects of teaching Shakespeare that I perhaps get less pleasure from now than I did in youth. And then another aspect of teaching Shakespeare, which I'm getting more fun from at the moment than I've probably had doing any other teaching ever. The exciting part of the presentation, the bit with the adrenaline, is about to happen now as I attempt to share my screen. So hold tight, and with luck, we should transfer to some nice pictures. Here we go. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. And I'm going to do that. You should now have a picture in front of you of a sort of title slide called Teaching Shakespeare Interculturally, which ought to change when I do that. Is that working?
Yes, sir, it's working.
Oh, great. Well, look, there we are. There, then. I promise I will tell you who these two people are. This chap with the sort of pheasant feathers in his hat and the red puppet on the right later on. For the moment, they just give a spurious air of interest and dynamism to what is actually just a title slide. So I move on immediately to this, since it would probably make sense for me to describe the kind of institutional context in which I nowadays do the teaching of Shakespeare, and at the same time provide, as it were, a word from our sponsor. That building at the top is the building that houses the Shakespeare Institute, and you've already heard the most important thing about the Shakespeare Institute, which is that it trained Poonam Trivedi. We have a very good record with research students from India, with research students working on the Indian subcontinent. If you want to do serious research about Shakespeare, please come to us. Other things to note about the Institute: we have a very valuable painting of the Moorish ambassador to the court of Elizabeth I. That's him at the top left. I'm about to hitch a ride with him when he goes on loan to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. But he sort of represents the fact that the Institute has always seen Shakespeare in an international context and seen Shakespeare's own culture in an international context. It was designed to draw research students from all over the world, to be a resource for translators as well as for literary students. We have a wonderful library. The Institute was set up in 1951. Everything has been hand-chosen for the purposes of Shakespearean scholarship. That's Karen Thompson, librarian, at the top right. It includes particular specialist archives. It includes a wonderful set of albums and letters from Geoffrey Kendall's Shakespeareana Company, which toured India and other parts of Asia in the 40s and 50s. We are, according to the university propaganda department, keeping Shakespeare alive, which makes it sound as though we've kidnapped him and we're demanding a ransom, but we're not. We do not regard Shakespeare as exclusive private property or as any kind of hostage. It's a research department of the University of Birmingham that hides in Stratford. Our resident students are all research students, about 140 master's students, more than half of whom are actually all over the world studying with us via distance learning, and then a smaller and fluctuating number of doctoral students, and a crack team of academics, including this woman drinking the cappuccino in an art gallery in Brazil, Professor Tiffany Stern, who would, I think, be quite annoyed by some of what I'm going to say this afternoon. So I hope she hasn't tuned in. Down there, you can see a weird photograph that the university propaganda department took of me with Professor Ewan Fernie, who's another Institute faculty member, Dr. Erin Sullivan, who's great, who does digital stuff, and who is actually not as tall as me. I don't know what they've done with this picture. And a sample PhD student called Corinne Furness, who's been working with the RSC, the Royal Shakespeare Company, our neighbours in Stratford, about the work they've done in collaboration with non-professional performers around the United Kingdom. Anyway, that's who we are. This is the Shakespeare Institute. This is where I nominally am. So what I want to talk about is to outline what seem to me two models for teaching Shakespeare, two priorities we might have when imparting to our students what Shakespeare means, the contexts especially within which Shakespeare means. And that's one context you can see. What you're looking at behind the writing on this screen is the statue of Shakespeare that's placed centrally above the main door of the University of Birmingham that was put there when the university was founded in 1900. This is a university which has always regarded Shakespeare as its kind of unique selling point. It's part of a whole pantheon. What you're seeing there is Shakespeare between Plato and Newton, but you get some other worthies like Beethoven and Faraday along the way, but Shakespeare's in the middle, which is the main thing. Shakespeare is in the middle of, as I say, these two particular things we tend to do when we teach Shakespeare, one of which I would describe as telling stories about authentic origins and vertical pedigrees, the other which is telling stories about intercommunication and lateral connections. So here are some characteristic things that Shakespearean teaching does, especially at school and undergraduate levels, at least in the educational systems within which I've mainly worked, principally in Britain and America, though as you've heard, with forays to other places like China and Sweden. There is perpetually a strong sense that we are dealing with history, that the important things about Shakespeare involve the fact that his work is old, the fact that his work comes from a particular cultural moment in a particular place, and that it is the main duty of Shakespearean teachers to immerse their students in, quote, Shakespeare's world, a world that existed between 1564 and 1616 and didn't extend much beyond England, a world that focuses on our knowledge of early editions of Shakespeare, records about Shakespeare, published texts of Shakespeare produced during his lifetime and immediately afterwards, like the first folio seen here. So here are things that Shakespearean scholars have typically done and that have typically informed what they have required their students to know, if only as a kind of pathway or first hurdle towards doing other things. Biography. A lot of effort around Shakespeare studies has been devoted to finding out about Shakespeare's life, placing the works in the context of Shakespeare's life, putting the works into chronological order, coming up with hypotheses about which ones he wrote when he was still freelance in London, which ones he may have written when he was still in Stratford, when he was young, perhaps trying out some of the early sonnets, which ones he wrote after he apparently became less involved in the day-to-day running of his theatre company in London, which ones come from the late period in his life, mapping the works against the life, looking for allusions to things in the plays which connect up with things in Shakespeare's imagined experience based on the biographical records we have about Mr. William Shakespeare of Stratford in the county of Warwick, as he describes himself in legal testimony in London. Another key activity for Shakespearean scholars is settling the text of the plays, understanding which options we might have when there are discrepancies between early printings of the plays from Shakespeare's lifetime, and sorting out the printing history that lies behind books like the First Folio. What represents an authorial draft or the ghost of an authorial draft? What represents revisions possibly made by the theatre company? Which things are just misprints? Why the printed original first printings of plays like Hamlet vary amongst themselves, how we would present them if we were to edit, put out our own definitive version of a text of Hamlet. Then there is source study, explaining what's in the plays by reference to things that Shakespeare had clearly heard about or read, comparing Hamlet to earlier versions of the Hamlet story that survive, seeing what Shakespeare did differently and what Shakespeare did the same, and so on. Then glossing those texts again, explaining, interpreting, supplementing Shakespeare's plays by talking about their historical context. For example, what do we know about the revival of Richard II that seems to have taken place in association with the Essex Rebellion? What does it tell us about the play that it was used in this context? Which bits of Midsummer Night's Dream may be allusions to Elizabeth I, whether flattering or otherwise? All the things that a student might need explaining in Shakespeare's language that are references to what were everyday objects, everyday practices, common knowledge in England in the late 16th century that have been forgotten by most people since. And then there is the antiquarian project of Elizabethan theatre history, explaining Shakespeare's plays in terms of what we can deduce about how they were staged at the time. Who were the actors Shakespeare was writing for? What kind of stages were they appearing on? What cultural expectations did Shakespeare's audiences bring to a play that was or wasn't labeled a comedy or a tragedy? How many actors did he have at his disposal? How much doubling went on? Are there some roles that are intended to be doubled in ways that are supposed to mean something when it's the same actor playing the same part? What can we further understand about the way Shakespeare writes about men and women from knowing that his company used young men to play female parts and didn't have as many young men as they had mature men, so that the female parts are fewer and on the whole smaller? This is all terribly familiar stuff. This is stuff you get in pretty much any edition of Shakespeare that you buy, any single play edition in particular, and it may include histories of criticism and of performance, what this play has meant over the years, which invariably trace it all back to the beginning. A Midsummer Night's Dream has always produced this particular line of interpretations. There's an unbroken history of understanding this play and of performing this play that goes back to Shakespeare. The assumption being that all critics interpreting a Shakespeare play across the last 400 years and all performers staging a Shakespeare play across the last 400 years have all been doing the same play, the most important things about which were all put into it in that magic period of the Shakespearean between 1564 and 1616. That we're looking at the real Shakespeare, who lived in this period when everything meant something, and when the Elizabethan period was this glorious cultural moment when there was this fantastic theatre, these extraordinary people, this amazing linguistic fluency. That all happened then, and everything since has flowed from it. And the most important thing we can do for our own readings and stagings of Shakespeare is to rejoin ourselves to that great pedigree that goes all the way back to Stratford, the centre of the Shakespearean world, or at very least, Stratford via London. And much teaching of Shakespeare in the English-speaking world, wherever you go, is still obsessed with getting its students through this bit of cultural literacy, this compulsory obedience testing, that in order to say anything worthwhile about Hamlet, you have to be able to answer a pub quiz about the dates of the early texts, what we think Shakespeare had read on the subject before he wrote it, who was in the original cast, and so on, as though all meanings of Hamlet are only there for us because that play was written in 1600. I point out, incidentally, that this has been very much part of the imperial story of the teaching of Shakespeare in English, that parts of the world that speak English often do so because they were parts of the British Empire, and there was very often an emphasis in the educational systems that they were given in proving that you were good enough to talk with the English by knowing about Shakespeare in English and knowing those things about how Shakespeare is absolutely English and part of the great legacy from this supposedly miraculous period in English history when everything was generative and meant something. And I note in passing, and with a certain amount of embarrassment, that the building that the Shakespeare Institute took over used to belong to the British Council. We've inherited some of the mission of the Institute from what the British Council used to have to do in terms of explaining the prestige and the glory of English culture, even though the empire that used to underpin that view had nominally been abolished. Now, here's another thing you can do with Shakespeare, or at least two subsets of it. Talk about the ways in which Shakespeare's plays connect cultures, connect people, make meaning with no reference at all to what may or may not have been going on in Stratford or London in the 1590s. One thing you can do, and one thing that the Institute has always done, is talk about how Shakespeare actually means in the live theatre now. One of the other cultures that does quite different things to Shakespeare than what academic editors do with Shakespeare is the live theatre. This picture shows Stanley Wells, a former Institute PhD student who became a fellow and then its director and is now emeritus of everything, and me, and Dame Judi Dench, who was one of the first theatre people to be made an honorary fellow of the Institute. And we keep in touch with these people, and our students ask them things that are not about the 1590s. If when you staged Hamlet, what choices did you make? What were you thinking about? What kinds of audiences were you trying to reach? In my experience, people do not go to see productions of Richard II because they want to know about the Essex Rebellion any more than they go to see productions of Macbeth because they're hoping to learn about the Gunpowder Plot and what James I might have thought about it. They tend to go because they're interested in life, death, murder, and possibly even in Macbeth. It's much of what Shakespeare means and much of what makes Shakespeare valuable has nothing to do with pub quizzes about a particular period of English history, during which most people, I imagine, were bored, distracted, and anxious, rather than full of glorious creative meaning, just as most people are in most periods of history. Anyway, here's a gallery of some of the nice actors that and directors that we keep in touch with at the Institute. And of course, we have a collaboration with the Royal Shakespeare Company next door, in case we forget that there are other things to do with these plays than try and flog another Arden edition. But the most exciting thing about Shakespeare, to me, the most important thing about Shakespeare, and the thing that tells you most about the nature of these plays, is the way in which they work in all kinds of totally different cultural contexts and locations. The fact that people who have nothing to do with the British Empire can do things with Shakespeare in translation, in different media, in different places. And I finally got to set up a course that would specifically teach Shakespeare interculturally just this last academic year, after lots of institutional effort, in collaboration with the National University of Singapore. As you see, it's called Performing Shakespeare in Asia, and it operates only as an online distance learning course, so that students attached to the Institute and students attached to the National University of Singapore can be online together and talking about video recordings of different productions of Shakespeare from around East Asia. Students from totally different cultural backgrounds who are put in touch with each other and to whom these productions look utterly different. Some of them are students who know Shakespeare's plays in English backwards, but who know nothing about Asian theatre. Some of them are students who've seen lots and lots of kabuki, but have never bothered with Shakespeare much, and so on, and many possible combinations of those different things. So this is part of the blurb from the course's webpage. It's taught jointly, as I say, by Li Lan Yong and myself, with guest contributions from the whole team of scholars around Asia and the world who work on the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive. And do jot down that web address because it's the most fabulous thing. Yeah, there we are. We convene for a weekly seminar. The students compare notes about the productions and they do collaborative writing assessments. You know, they're put into pairs across institutions and across the world to make sense of these shows together. And brilliant people like Dipna Callahan give guest talks, people who've thought about these productions. This picture, by the way, is a brilliant Korean production of Hamlet called Hamlet Cantabile, in which the clowns / gravediggers are trying to lay to rest the souls of some of the characters by reviving them as puppets and acting out parts of the play. It's a fascinating thing. And that's really what this course brings. It gives students access to places where these stories and these dramatic structures are being reread according to the assumptions of different cultural forms, different, often entirely different religious frames of reference or political frames of reference. And I promised you I would tell you who this chap is. He is King Uru, from a show called Uruvang, which is a Korean opera based on King Lear, but which hybridizes King Lear with the story of Princess Bari, who is the founding semi-divine patroness of Korean shamanism. She occupies the place in the story normally occupied by Cordelia, the fool. His roles in the play and a great deal of the storytelling are taken over by a team of minstrels. And in the mad scenes in the storm, they put up this little puppet booth around Uru, the Mad King, in which they act out various things, some of it involving this red puppet, and some of it involving actually holding up the puppetry booth to show that they are representing to the king that he is himself a puppet, and a not very competent one at that. And on the right, we see Li Lan Yong herself, just to give her due credit, because she mainly set up this archive, and she's a great teacher. The thing that makes this course so particularly pleasurable to teach is that because the way in which we have validated it institutionally is that a parallel version of the course exists in the Birmingham system, along with a parallel version in the Singapore system, so that each institution, even though the course only meets once a week, is sort of paying full price. We can do joint teaching. Usually, if you say, I want a team teacher course, a university says, well, it's too expensive. I'm only paying you. You teach it on your own. With this course, because it's taught as a blend of courses, versions of the same course at two separate institutions, Li Lan and I are there in every single class. And each session is framed by the genuine intercultural dialogue between Li Lan and I, because there are things Li Lan knows that I don't, and things Li Lan expects that I don't, and things and vice versa. And finding out what the students need to know, or what they want to know, and what they expect and what they find to be totally false assumptions has been fascinating. Western students tend to assume that Asian theatre forms are absolutely fixed and timeless, and that every single kabuki play is always the same. Similarly, Asian students, in my experience, from Southeast Asia at least, have tended to assume that there is an unbroken tradition of doing Shakespeare live that is continuous since Shakespeare's time. Whereas, as everybody knows, or at least as many people in the West know, actually the business of staging Shakespeare in the West has been a business of perpetual reinvention. Nobody knew how Shakespeare had performed Shakespeare's plays after 1642 for the most part. And even those who did found that knowledge totally irrelevant from then on. And it's been like that in most generations since. So let me recommend to you, if you possibly can, if you are going to teach Shakespeare, if you want to enjoy it, teach it interculturally. Never mind this obedience testing, never mind the bizarre claim that the value of Shakespeare's plays resides in the fact that they're souvenirs from ye olde merry England in the 1590s. That has nothing to do with most of the pleasures and possibilities these scripts offer, whether in the theatre or in a book. So I'm delighted to have been able to advertise this course to you. I hope you will bear it in mind when you're considering where to do a research degree in Shakespeare via distance learning. Thank you very much.
I'm very pleased to come after Professor Dobson. And in fact, he has articulated many of the things we have been fighting for in the Indian universities, to bring some interculturalism or bring our own backgrounds and our own theatre and literary histories into the teaching of English literature, and in a way revitalize it for the current moment. I taught Shakespeare for my entire teaching career of almost 40 years. And much of my research was provoked by searching questions by my students. And as you have announced, I have spent a lot of time researching performance of Shakespeare in India in the various languages. So today I'm going to present some ideas on an adaptation of King Lear in Marathi called Nat Samrat, which was a play, and then it was also filmed. And I think I chose this because it's an outstanding and a very significant example of a deep and pervasive intertextuality with Shakespeare, and with not only King Lear, but many other plays all interwoven into it. And it's a play and a film that has been neglected in some ways in the annals of Indian Shakespeare, because it has remained in a way submerged in the self-contained literary and performative regional culture of Maharashtra. And I find that, and lots of quotations, echoes, traces in translation and in English crop up very frequently in the play and in the film, which layer and structure the emotional and philosophical narrative. So both the film, Nat Samrat, which means actor king, done in 2016, and the play written in 1970 with the same title, both of these comprise I find, very unique instances of a post-colonial rewriting and a review of the legacy of Shakespeare in India. I might add that, I'm very pleased also, before I go on to this, to hear of the Shakespeare, in intercultural Shakespeare course being offered by the Shakespeare Institute, and in collaboration with the Asian Shakespeare Performance Archive, done at the University of Singapore. I just like to point out that in this Shakespeare in Asia Performance Archive, Indian productions and Indian theatre productions and Indian films are quite absent. Somehow, their stretch of Shakespeare, of Asian Shakespeare, does not cover India. So perhaps we in the Indian universities need to do something more to spread this knowledge. Okay, so the To Be or Not to Be Lear, Nat Samrat, and the Marathi film and theatre. The play Nat Samrat by poet-dramatist V.V. Shirvadkar, and the film, directed by Mahesh Manjrekar, repurposes King Lear to dramatize the story of Ganpat Rao Balverkar, a famed but aging thespian known for his Shakespearean roles, who struggles in retirement to adapt to the realities of life beyond the illusions of theatre. The play is located in the 1930s, during the heyday of the early Marathi theatre, which had evolved like most modern Indian theatres under the influence of the Western model, especially Shakespeare. Like Lear, Ganpat Rao divides all his property between a son and a daughter here, but frictions with the daughter-in-law explode. He feels insulted and moves in with the daughter. But frictions again force him to leave in the middle of the night, a night troubled with an impending storm. He loses his wife, becomes destitute and delusional. Though the play concentrates on a single familial story, cutting the subplot and seemingly domesticating the vast epical landscape of Lear, its energy and bite lies in its extended analogy of Lear's crumbling kingdom with the changing world of Marathi theatre, where once Ganpat Rao ruled as emperor in its heyday. By implication, the play comments on the evolving political stage of the new nation of independent India. Marathi theatre took its form, that is the 5-act structure, characterization with an interiority, and the tragic genre lie largely from Shakespeare. But it also carved its own distinctive regional profile. It moved from mythologicals and melodramas to political comment very early. Its first scripted prose play, that is 1861, The Elder Madhav Rao Peshwa, was openly critical of the British administration. It opened with a Sutradhar figure announcing that he intends to lead the audience to a real Maratha Darbar, not one where the orders of the inhabitants of a court, this is, quoting the Sutradhar or the chorus figure in the beginning, a real Maratha Darbar, where, quote, the orders of the inhabitants of a foreign island prevail, and where kings, mere caged parrots, have not even seen the shadow of their own power, unquote. Later plays stepped up criticism in various ways, leading to some being banned. Marathi theatre distanced itself from pure entertainment and has been, as has been observed, developed as an ally of the nationalist movement. We need to recall that the Marathas were the dominant ruling class in much of India before being defeated by the British in 1818. And unlike the Bengalis, the Marathi intelligentsia, who had an older literature of their own, were not initially enthused by English literature. On the contrary, as has been surmised, they took to English literature as compensatory for the loss of political power. This is a comment by G.P. Deshpande, very well known Marathi playwright and critic. Natsamrat the play, written in 1970, 23 years after independence, does not contain any direct political comment, but reflects the late 1960s disillusionment with the dreams of independent India, when wars with China and Pakistan, famine, economic recession seemed to dent the early promises. Though the playwright Shirvatkar, induction into Shakespeare, has a political inflection. Very interestingly, he has recounted how he first found and read Shakespeare amongst the books that were stored in his house's loft after the local library was raided and shut down following the assassination of the English collector of Nasik in 1910. The play was written as a vehicle for a legendary older actor, Nana Saab Pathak, who was frustrated with the new experimentalism of Marathi theatre. It therefore weaves many references to the founding stalwarts of theatre, their styles and successes. It also ventures a self-reflexive jibe at the changing trends. Why adapt? It says. Why use Shakespeare as a crutch? Ganpat Rao both celebrates the golden age of Marathi theatre as he recounts its successes and bemoans its passing. Natsamrat does not simply melodramatic nostalgia, as it is often criticized to be, but a requiem for the past glory of Marathi theatre and all that it is often criticized to be. But a requiem for the past glory of Marathi theatre and all that it had formulated and absorbed, while also voicing a second generational, national, post-colonial mood of the late 1960s. The film, Natsamrat, produced in 2016, directed by Mahesh Manjrekar, and closely based on the play, enhances this centering on theatre. It intercuts scenes of the familial trauma with several flashbacks of Ganpat performing, entering into the roles of the Shakespearean greats, actualizing as cinema can do the golden era of Marathi theatre for us. It introduces a couple of new characters to flesh out and shift the play's singular focus on the Lear figure, mainly through Ram Bhau, a fellow actor, and a Kent fool-like figure, exchanges with whom plot out their lives in the theatre. The film opens with Ganpat, Lear, destitute, delusional, and wandering, searching for answers. When he comes to know that his theatre has burnt down, he rushes to it and is heartbroken to see his karma bhumi, or his field of action, in ruins. Memories of the past, of his famous performances, flood back to haunt him. He starts reciting these parts, inhabiting the stage once again. The first flashback, appropriately, being Lear on the heath in a defiant mood. To quote him, he shouts, "Hey, you divine forces, give me the tenacity of rocks. Bless me with patience. No, you ungrateful wretches, I will not cry." Unquote. The image of this burnt out theater and a stage in shambles recurs in the film to symbolize the irrevocable change in Marathi theater. At the end, Ganpat's children suddenly appear, contrite, begging him to return home with them. In the tragic Shakespearean heroic fashion, he refuses to relinquish his stage of action, and in reenacting his many parts, he collapses. But not before forecasting, it's time to begin a new show. I can hear the final bell. At the end, I like to play a little clip which will illustrate particularly this scene quite vividly for all of you. Nat Samrat therefore becomes a mirror film, the action meta-cinematically reflecting the life of the actor, blurring the lines between illusion and reality, stage and life, and in the process, glancing at the rapidly changing nation state too. Coming 46 years after the play was written, the film takes a long distance view, and in adapting the adaptation, brings the period piece closer to Shakespeare and to the current moment. The fragmentation of the hallowed Indian family, with the selfish disregard of the elders, rings in a growing social issue in India today. Lear's hovel, which is picturized as a shelter under a flyover bridge, inhabited by destitute and, and the only resting place that the vast metropolis of Mumbai can afford Ganpat, is a sign of the growing urban callousness of developing India. And this shelter too is destroyed during a police raid. The film also affords a salient example of a regional culture being overshadowed by the national and the commercial. Though the very first Indian films, Pundalik 1912 and Raja Harishchandra 1913, were made by Marathi speakers, the Marathi film industry has languished as a minor regional cinema overshadowed by the national Hindi film industry, also located in Mumbai. Modern Marathi theatre, on the other hand, beginning in 1853, has grown to become the indisputable leading theatre in India today. Nat Samrat, the film, is part of Marathi New Wave cinema, which is now producing small budget indie and serious cinemas, which is light years ahead of Bollywood. The film does more. It elevates the incipient Shakespearean intertextuality of the play text, especially the metaphor of all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players, into a Hamletian disquisition about the meaning of life and fate. These lines are recalled by Ganpat in the film in English to reconcile himself to his changing condition in life. Quote, "Every man must play a part, and unfortunately, my son, mine is a sad one," he says. Unquote. The domain of the great stage, the parts played by the actors, the nature of role playing, the sliding spectrum of reality within performance on the physical stage and in the metaphoric world, and a persistent questioning of the portion or the part allocated to each by fate, comes up again and again in the debates between Ganpat and Bhav. The play's long monologues and Shakespearean soliloquies are dispersed into conversations between the two friends in the film. Together they introspect. Quote, "An actor's life is a curse. We are endlessly insecure people, mirror-loving, selfish beings. Those who work in the theater or cinema live in a false world." It's very difficult to nurture your real self. It's a hard price to pay, unquote. The kingly egotism of Lear, paralleling that of the actor king Ganpat, is laid bare. Quote again, being an actor seeps into your cells. It stays there. We wear the masks of the characters and lose our real identities, unquote. And this leads to a cathartic self-realization by Ganpat. Quote, we were mere messengers, a mere actor who scavenged on the words of writers, unquote. Hamlet's famed soliloquy, to be or not to be, crops up here too, harnessed to articulate the angst of Ganpat, the former king of the stage, abandoned by his own. It wells up, unprompted, when Ganpat, watching a play, finds old memories swarming on him, and unable to control himself, stands up and starts reciting the soliloquy. Quote, is it wise to live a useless, shameless, and helpless existence? Or should I end the suffering? O Almighty, why have you been so cruel? Now, where do these bones seek refuge? I'm only giving you brief quotes. There is a long soliloquy in Marathi, which is really very poetic. The actorly persona resurfaces to berate the heavens. They have filled my body with the ghosts of so many characters. I gave your grief an identity. I made it bigger than my life. But what about me? I showed your tears, but you never valued this actor's grief. I may never get justice anywhere in this world, but shouldn't I find it here on this stage? In a significant post-colonizing intervention, the film interpolates an intertextuality with the Indian epic, the Mahabharata. As a response to these soul-searching Hamletian questions and Lear-like dilemmas. The well-known dialogue between Krishna and Karna, the one tragic character in the Mahabharata, in which Karna berates Krishna about the harsh and unfair fate meted out to him, springs out unbidden in the banter between the friends when Ganpat visits a dying Bahu in the hospital. It intersperses a Hindu dharmic view onto the tragic to stand beside the Shakespearean. Quote, bear your hardships and forgive everyone, says Krishna. And something that Ganpat is not ready to acknowledge. Through this juxtaposition, the film owns and embeds the tragic in the Indian ethos. While much more can be said about the complexities of Shakespearean intertextuality, for the moment it will suffice to say that Natsamrat, the play, and the film particularly present unique examples of a latter-day post-colonial critique and transformational rewriting of Shakespearean tragedy, very local, but also global, which assimilates, reflects upon, owns, and ultimately celebrates the Shakespearean heritage of Marathi theatre and now cinema. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this very prestigious series. Thank you.